23-year-old Laura Kempton was found dead on September 28, 1981. She had last been seen in the early hours of that morning entering her home, a ground-floor apartment on Chapel Street in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Her body was discovered by a police officer who had come to serve her a court summons related to unpaid parking tickets. But what he found was far worse. The front door showed signs of a break-in. Through the half-open door, he spotted a body. The crime was heinous. Laura had been covered by a mattress and bedding, her ankles tied with an electrical cord. She had been sexually assaulted before death. Authorities later determined that a wine bottle had likely been used to attack her, before, during, or after the assault. Laura was a student at the Portsmouth Beauty School, where she was studying to become a hairdresser. She was also an employee at the Marco Polo gift store and Karen's ice cream parlor. Hardworking and social, she was known as a free spirit with a big personality. Investigators determined that she had likely died shortly after arriving home. She had suffered blunt force trauma to the side of her head. For weeks, detectives chased down leads, trying to make sense of the murder. But weeks turned into months, months into years, and the case went cold. Then, in 2023, an announcement came. Laura's killer had been identified. Ronnie James Lee was a 21-year-old man living and working in Portsmouth at the time of the murder. Assistant Attorney General Gretchen Harrington noted that there was no evidence that the two knew each other. Lee was born in 1960 and served briefly in the military until 1981. Afterward, he began working for MBI Security at Liberty Mutual in Portsmouth. In November 1982, he was arrested for theft. At the time, he was living with his mother. Laura's murder wasn't his only crime. Lee had been convicted of a string of offenses, including 5 burglaries, 2 of which he pled guilty to, as well as sexual assault. In 1987, he was convicted in a case stemming from yet another burglary. He was sentenced to prison for 3 years. While Lee cannot be charged in Laura's case, investigators now consider the murder solved. Lee died in 2005 at the age of 45 from acute cocaine intoxication. Had he lived, he would currently be facing first-degree murder charges. On the morning of August 15, 1975, 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington left her home to attend her summer Bible school. She was a resident of Broomall, Pennsylvania, and her church, the Trinity Chapel Christian Reformed Church, was less than half a mile away. It should have been a short, safe walk. But somewhere along the way, something terrible happened. Gretchen never made it to Bible school. Her father, a pastor at a secondary church location, soon realized that something was wrong. Hours passed, and Gretchen was still nowhere to be found. Worried, he reached out to his friend, David Zanstra, the pastor of the church where Gretchen had been headed that morning, and asked him to call the authorities. Zanstra did, and an extensive search for the missing girl began. But there was no trace of her. Nearly 2 months later, on October 14th, the search came to a devastating end. Skeletal remains were discovered in Ridley Creek State Park, not far from where Gretchen had disappeared. Authorities soon confirmed that the remains belonged to the 8-year-old girl. The cause of death? Blunt force trauma to the skull. It was officially ruled a homicide. Despite a police investigation, the case quickly grew cold. For decades, there were no answers, no justice, no closure. But in 2023, almost 48 years after Gretchen's murder, there was finally a breakthrough. On July 24th, the Delaware County District Attorney's Office made a shocking announcement. 83-year-old David Zanstra had been arrested and charged with criminal homicide in the first, second, and third degrees, as well as kidnapping a minor and possession of an instrument of crime. The truth had finally come to light. Just a week earlier, investigators had decided to re-interview Zanstra, the very man who had once led the church Gretchen was supposed to attend that fateful morning. A devoted family friend, a trusted community figure, a man whose own daughter had been Gretchen's closest companion. At first, Zanstra denied any involvement, but when confronted with evidence of past sexual misconduct, he broke down. He confessed. He admitted that he had seen little Gretchen walking alone on the road that morning. He claimed he had offered her a ride to church, and, trusting him as a family friend, she had accepted. But instead of taking her to Bible school, he drove her to a secluded wooded area. There, he parked the car and told her to remove her clothing. The 8-year-old refused. Angered by her defiance, Zandstra struck her with his fist, leaving her bleeding. Then, believing she was dead, he covered her body and fled the scene. District Attorney Jack Stolzheimer did not mince words. This is a man who was a remorseless child predator, someone who pretended to be a friend, a neighbor, a man of God. And he killed this poor little girl. For nearly 50 years, Zandstra had played the role of a loving, trusted family friend, even after Gretchen's death. Investigators had not initially considered him a suspect, but that changed in the autumn of 2022 when a woman came forward with a chilling story from her childhood. She had been just 10 years old when Gretchen went missing. She lived in Havertown, about 3 miles from where the crime occurred, and, like Gretchen, she had been friends with one of Zandstra's daughters. She often slept over at their house. But one night, she awoke to find Zandstra molesting her. Terrified, she pretended to be asleep. He left the room, but returned the next night. When she finally worked up the courage to ask Zandstra's daughter about what had happened, the girl simply replied, "He does that sometimes." The 10-year-old went home and told her parents. They immediately forbade her from ever staying at the pastor's house again. But that wasn't all. She had kept diaries from the 1970s, filled with notes about strange and frightening events. One entry in particular stood out. Guess what? A man tried to kidnap Holly twice. It's a secret, so I can't tell anyone. But I think he might be the one who kidnapped Gretchen. I think it was Mr. Z, double quote. Her suspicions were terrifyingly accurate. On the day Gretchen disappeared, multiple witnesses reported seeing her speaking with a man inside a car. Some even described a vehicle that matched Zandstra's. But back then, investigators had been unable to make a solid connection between him and the crime. Now, nearly 50 years later, DNA was collected from Zandstra following his arrest. It is currently being tested to see if it matches evidence from any open or unsolved cases. Investigators fear that, due to his long-standing role as a pastor, Zandstra may have abused many more victims over the years. For the family of Gretchen Harrington, the arrest brings some long-awaited justice, but the scars of her tragic death will never fully heal. A little girl, full of life and innocence, had her future stolen by a man she trusted, a man who hid behind the guise of faith. Now, at last, he will face the consequences. 49-year-old Yekaterina Belay was last seen on the evening of September 28, 2014, near her home on Rock Springs Drive in Melbourne, Florida. According to her daughter, Yekaterina had planned a quick trip to the store. Just half an hour, she said, but she never returned. For years, Yekaterina and her white 2003 Honda Odyssey remained missing, vanished without a trace. Days turned into months, months into years, and hope of finding answers slowly faded. But just over a decade after she was last seen, a breakthrough finally came. Since 2022, Sunshine State Sonar has been working with Florida authorities to locate missing persons and vehicles submerged in waterways. The program, consisting of volunteers and divers, sifts through missing person databases to identify possible cases. On December 20th, 2024, their efforts finally paid off. Yekaterina's vehicle was discovered beneath 23 feet of water in a retention pond at the corner of Merle Road and Vieira Boulevard. The license plate was a perfect match. According to Sunshine State Sonar, their team had worked closely with the Brevard County Sheriff's Office to obtain mobile phone data. This allowed them to pinpoint the last known location of Yekaterina's phone and begin an extensive search. Florida is full of lakes, ponds, and canals. It wouldn't be easy. They searched dozens of bodies of water in the area, each time hoping, each time coming up empty until they found the right pond. During their search, they also discovered 2 other vehicles submerged in the same water. One of them had reportedly been stolen. Michael Sullivan, the leader of Sunshine State Sonar, recalled the moment they found Yekaterina's car. "We searched 33 bodies of water, and she was in the 33rd. I was a little surprised we were actually able to get to her that quickly, just because there are probably 500 bodies of water in that area. But there was an unexpected problem. We located Yekaterina's van on the first day, but we couldn't dive on it. There were 2 alligators hanging around and they wouldn't leave, so we decided to come back in the daytime to do it safely. When they finally got underwater, there was no doubt. The first thing we saw was the Honda logo. Then we noticed the white paint. We looked at the license plate number, and we knew. The pond where Yekaterina's vehicle was found was just 2 miles from her home. In early January 2025, investigators confirmed that the remains inside the vehicle matched Yekaterina through dental records. Her daughters, who had spent a decade without answers, were finally able to bring their mother home. Back in 2014, the area had been searched, but the bodies of water were not thoroughly examined. At the time, mobile phone tracking technology was far more limited than it is today. The case had gone cold until now. Sasha Belay, one of Yekaterina's daughters, never believed her mother had left willingly. It just wouldn't be like her. Her children came above anything else in her life. On the 10th anniversary of Yekaterina's disappearance, just weeks before she was found, her daughters posted online, remembering their mother. She had immigrated from Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, searching for a better life. A highly educated woman, she held degrees in geology and environmental science, yet she devoted herself to her family above all else. At the time of her disappearance, Yekaterina had been struggling with mental illness. She had also spent years locked in a bitter divorce with the father of her children. Some had speculated that she left voluntarily, but her daughters never believed that. Now, as investigators work to determine the exact circumstances of her death, one thing is certain: her family finally has answers. She is no longer missing. She is home. Ruth Marie Terry, formerly known as the Lady of the Dunes. On July 26, 1974, the decomposing body of a woman was discovered in the dunes of Race Point, Provincetown, Massachusetts. She was found lying among the shrubbery just yards away from a road. Investigators determined that she had likely died about 2 weeks prior. Her body was positioned face down on half of a beach blanket, leading authorities to theorize that she either knew her killer or had been murdered in her sleep. There were no defensive wounds, no clear signs of a struggle. She was described as being around 5 feet 6 inches, weighing approximately 145 pounds. Her red hair was pulled back into a ponytail, and her toenails were painted pink. Beneath her head, someone had placed a blue bandana and a pair of Wrangler jeans. She had undergone expensive dental work, yet she was missing several teeth, along with her hands and one forearm, likely to prevent identification through fingerprints or dental records. Her cause of death? Blunt force trauma to the head. One side of her skull had been completely crushed, possibly with a military-style entrenching tool. She had been nearly decapitated. There were also indications of sexual assault, most likely post-mortem. The case quickly went cold. With no name, no clear leads, and no one coming forward to claim her, she was buried in October 1974 and given a haunting title, the Lady of the Dunes. Decades passed. In 2015, a bizarre theory surfaced. Some believed that the Lady of the Dunes had been an extra in Steven Spielberg's 1975 film Jaws. The movie had been filmed on Martha's Vineyard, just about 100 miles south of Provincetown. In the 4th of July beach scene, an extra appeared wearing a blue bandana and jeans, eerily similar to the description of the victim. But like so many other leads before it, nothing came of the theory. Once again, her case faded into obscurity. Then, in 2022, a breakthrough. A forensic genealogy corporation, Othram Incorporated, began testing skeletal remains from the Lady of the Dunes. And on October 31st, the FBI made a long-awaited announcement. Jane Doe had a name, Ruth Marie Terry. Born on September 8, 1936, in Whitwell, Tennessee, Ruth's early life remains largely unknown. But in 1957, at the age of 21, following a brief marriage, she moved to Leonia, Michigan. There, she found work at the Fisher Body Automotive plant. Her sister-in-law, Jan Terry, remembered her as someone deeply loved by her family. Her brother, Ken, described her as a free spirit. She was looking for something more than just a country life, I guess you'd say. In 1958, Ruth gave birth to her son, Richard. Struggling financially, she made the heartbreaking decision to let her workplace superintendent and his wife, close friends of hers, adopt the boy in exchange for covering her expenses. Once the adoption was finalized, Ruth moved to California. She reconnected with her son briefly in 1972, but he was a teenager by then, not quite ready to rebuild a relationship. At some point in the following years, Ruth met a man named Guy Rockwell Molden. The two married on February 16, 1974. Molden, an antiques dealer based in Reno, Nevada, gave Ruth's family an uneasy feeling when they met him. He was possessive, controlling. 4 months before her body was found, Ruth visited her family. Her grandniece later recalled that Ruth didn't seem like herself when she was around her husband. Her family also noticed Malden's overbearing behavior. Then, in the late summer of 1974, Malden returned to Tennessee alone. He told Ruth's family that she had gone missing from their home in California. Ruth's sister-in-law, Jan, later recalled, "He was so blunt. He just said he didn't know where she was, and all that. But he didn't stay very long." Her brother James was alarmed. He traveled to California and hired a private investigator to find her. What he uncovered was disturbing. Ruth's belongings had been sold. The investigator suggested she had left the state voluntarily, possibly joining a religious cult. Others in the family had their own theories. One relative thought she had entered the witness protection program. Her son, Richard, recalled how helpless they felt. They couldn't find anything. They confronted that Malden guy, and he just said, "She left, free-spirited, this, that, and the other." Decades passed. No answers came. Then, in 2022, when the family learned that Ruth had finally been identified, they felt a sense of relief. At last, they had closure. A month after her identification, investigators began looking into Malden, believing he had been the last person to see her alive, and what they found was chilling. In 1974, Malden had been driving Ruth's car. He had also told several people that she was dead. Then they uncovered his dark history. Born on October 27, 1923, Malden had a deeply disturbing past. In 1958, he married a woman named Manzanita Ryan. 2 years later, both Manzanita and her 18-year-old daughter Dolores vanished without a trace. Malden quickly became the prime suspect, but he fled Seattle before he could be questioned. Eventually, the FBI caught up with him. According to crime writer Ann Rule, police later found body parts in his septic tank, but were unable to confirm they belonged to the missing women. With no solid evidence, prosecutors were reluctant to press charges. And so, Malden walked free. That same year, he married for a third time. Then, in 1961, he was convicted of grand larceny for stealing $10,000 from his second wife's family, right around the time she and her daughter had disappeared. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but in 1962, a judge suspended the sentence on the condition that he repay the stolen money. A predator, slipping through the cracks of the justice system. In 2023, investigators officially named Malden as Ruth's killer, but they would never see him face justice. He had died in 2002 at the age of 78. Though he will never be charged, authorities now consider Ruth's case closed. For decades, she was the Lady of the Dunes, a nameless victim, buried with unanswered questions. Now, at least, she has her name back, Ruth Marie Terry.